Hi there, Michelle McDonald here. I just wanted to pop on this afternoon because I had a really great question in our group about where to begin when it comes to setting up your classroom. I know it can be super overwhelming, and so I thought, let's just talk about this because writing a response would probably take a little too long. So if you are joining me and if you can hear me, if you would go ahead and just comment in the bottom so I know that my speaker's great and that everything is working fine. If there's any issues, also let me know. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. So I have put together a two-step plan of attack, and I will post a handout for you so that you can go back and take a look at all of the things that we discussed. But I think that when you first get your classroom keys, that it can be pretty overwhelming. And so I have two steps that I think are really important to think about. And one is the actual classroom layout and your setup. And number two would be focusing on your routines and procedures. So one of the things that I want to just make known right off the bat is that you don't have to have a Pinterest perfect classroom. It can seem like, oh my gosh, I see these classrooms and they're amazing. And the bottom line is it takes a lot of money to have a Pinterest perfect classroom. And most likely those teachers have been in the profession for a while and have acquired materials and things that they are using in their classroom. So don't feel like I have to go spend a lot of money to have an effective classroom. Because the bottom line is that when I think about my own education, I don't remember all of the bulletin boards that were on the wall, and I don't remember how cute my classroom was, but I do remember my teacher, and I do remember how they made me feel on the first day of school or in the first week of school. And if you are teaching little kids, it may be their first experience in school, and so that positive from you as the teacher, that's what they're going to remember. Or if you have a new student that is coming from a different school, they're going to remember you. They probably won't remember how cute the walls were and the bulletin board. So don't stress about that. Just really think about the relationship. The other thing I would think about when I walk in my classroom is where I want the front of my room to be. Just because a bulletin board is on one wall or a whiteboard is in one position of the room doesn't mean it has to be the front of your room. I've now been in 4 different classrooms. So I have started from scratch a number of times. And what I've found is that the previous teacher's setup didn't always work for me. It wasn't my style, or I just didn't like it. And so I've actually taken whiteboards off the wall and moved it to a different wall. And it's okay to do that. You can ask your janitor for help or your IT person. They might be willing to move technology around. Sometimes they're a little hesitant, but just because one section is the front doesn't mean that you have to make it the front of the room. One thing that I would not get caught up in is putting a bunch of content on your bulletin boards. You can put some bulletin board paper up and then add your student content that they create after the first week of school, and that will be fine. You can use bulletin board paper that you might have in your supply room. Some other options I've found that work great are fabric, and I like to use fabric simply because it typically doesn't fade and I can use it again and again and again. So it's one-time purchase, but it can last a long time. You might also consider using for bulletin boards the vinyl tablecloths. You can pick a pack up of vinyl tablecloths at Walmart for super cheap. They're a little bit thin and hard to work with, but I like the bright colors, and so I'll go with that from time to time. But again, as far as having tons of content, don't need to worry so much about that. One of the other things that I would really say that a mistake I made was that I was afraid to ask my admin for manipulatives and supplies that were missing in my classroom. And I realized that my principal just didn't know that my classroom didn't have Unifix cubes. And my principal wasn't aware that the previous teacher had purchased a lot of things and taken them with her. And so if you are provided a curriculum and a set of instructions that you need to carry out, and it requires certain materials and manipulatives, don't be afraid to tell your admin or your principal and say, I can't carry out this curriculum if I don't have Unifix cubes. Or I'm supposed to teach world geography and my map is outdated. I had that happen. I had a map that was way outdated and I was too afraid to say anything. And I think that I found that I just need to, and I have had to be brave and ask, because a lot of times the principal just doesn't know. And what you may find is that sometimes materials are borrowed by other teachers and it ends up in another classroom. And so you might actually have a set of manipulatives or Unifix cubes and they're just not in your classroom because they're in another room. So don't be afraid to ask. One tip I have for you is utilizing Craigslist. I am on a budget like you guys as well. We just don't have a lot of funds for extra cutesy things sometimes. And I have found that Craigslist is an awesome place to find materials and furniture for my classroom for super cheap or even free. And I'll tell you how I've gone about this. Sometimes I've found materials that are so cool, but they cost, 10, 15 bucks. And I thought, why don't I ask the person that's selling this if they would be willing to donate it to my class. I'll let them know, hey, I'm a teacher. I saw that this bouncy ball would be great for flexible seating. Would you be willing to donate it? And I found a lot of sellers are willing to do that. They'll say, hey, where are you teaching? My kids at this school. That's so cool. Awesome. And so that's a great way to get some things for free. Putting an all call out. If you're a science teacher, I needed lab coats and I put out an all call on a Facebook buy sell trade group and people were like, oh yeah, I've got an extra lab coat. I didn't need it anymore. Sure, I'll donate it. So it's amazing what you can find for free without having to spend a lot of money out of pocket. One thing that I've also found is that there's this misconception about needing an area rug in your classroom. My first year teaching, I thought I need an area rug. And I went out, I borrowed money from my mom, and I bought an area rug, and I spent like 200 bucks. And I realize now that I could have just used painter's tape and marked off a spot on my floor and used rows for determining where my kids would sit. Would have saved me $200. And so if you don't have an area rug, you don't have to go out and buy one. You can even just mark off spots in your classroom. And again, if you have older kids and you want to do like a cafe setting, utilizing Craigslist is super, super helpful. I have another thing that I just wanted to mention when it comes to classroom setup is the classroom library. Don't stress about your classroom library right now. I've gone through multiple changes where I've categorized by genre, by author, by number, by level. It's okay to figure it out. You can put your books on the shelf, and I've even had parent volunteers help me categorize and organize my books. So if you don't get to that in the first week or before school starts, it's totally okay. I've sent home parents with labels to cut out for me and bring back. I've also given parents that have volunteered a stack of books, and I've gone and said, hey, can you look up the level for these? If you go onto arbookfinder.com, you can actually type in the title of a book and it will give you the book level. Even if your school doesn't use accelerated reader, you can still utilize their website. And that's super helpful if you want to label your books. You can hand that off to a parent and they can help you with that. So don't stress about that. So that was my first step, which is classroom setup. And I want to jump over to my second step, which I think is super important, which is your routines and procedures. So number one, I would say before school starts, there's a few things that you want to figure out. And one would be how you plan to communicate with parents. So on that first day of school, when your kids come in, you want to be able to give your handbook out to families. There's probably going to be notes from the office that go home. So figure out, are you going to have a folder system? Is it going to go home once a week, every day? Will you have separate folders, one for homework or one for take-home work? Just think about what works for you, and I would just have that figured out before the first day of school. The other thing I would figure out would be your classroom supplies. If you are in teaching the younger kiddos, you might have some community supplies. If you're working with older kids, high school, middle school, they probably already have their supplies and you probably don't need to have community supplies. But typically what I've found is that when students come in on the first day, they start unloading their backpack and they say, where do I put my glue? Where do I put my erasers and my pencils? And so if you plan on putting all of your pencils in one place or holding on to scissors because you don't want kids cutting their hair on the first day of school, maybe think about which supplies you want put into bins or where you would like them to place them so that isn't a hassle on the first day. The other thing I would think about would be your classroom management system. A lot of schools have an overall policy about how they handle behaviors, and it would be really good to figure out what that is. Ask your school counselor, ask your principal for your school policy. You also want to obtain a copy of your school policy book because it's good to read through that to know what your school expects and what the consequences are for certain actions. One thing that I found was really good to have handy was the phone number for my school counselor and the phone number for my school office, to have that place right by my telephone, because if I had an issue with a student for a behavior or I had a question, it was really nice to be able to get right to my phone and know that that's the number for the office if I need help, or this is the phone number for my school counselor. So having those numbers handy and ready is also just a little tidbit tip that I've found, especially if you find that you've got some behaviors in your classroom right off the bat. One thing that I would focus on as well is your classroom welcome letter and a handbook for how you run your classroom. I am going to provide an editable copy for you of the handbook that I've used in my classroom, and then also a copy of a school syllabus and overview that you can use for middle school and high school. So if you are not on my email list, I will put a link so that you can get onto my email list. I'm going to send that out today. So I'll include this handout from today, an editable copy of my student or parent handbook that you can go in and just type in and add your own verbiage, but I've kind of worded things out so you can kind of see, hey, I like this, or it doesn't work for me, and you can change it. It also includes a welcome letter that you can use if you are in middle school or high school. I have an academic policy sheet that you can go through to help you kind of figure out what works for you or what you would like, because sometimes you just need a starting place, and that I'm just hoping to save you some time with that. So I will get that set up for you. Also, one thing that is so important is to meet your team. If you are one of many first grade teachers or one of many second grade teachers, meet your team, familiarize yourself with how long they've been at the school, what worked for them, how often are you going to meet to collaborate if you can. If your school sets up collaboration time, that's so awesome. Not all schools do that. But familiarizing yourself with your team and the rest of your staff is so helpful, because if they've been at the school for a while, they probably know the answer to a lot of questions that you have. And one more thing I'm going to say is to make good friends with your support staff, with your janitor and your office staff, because really they'll come to your rescue if you were friends with them. So be good friends with your support staff. So I hope that some of these things are helpful for you to get you just off to the right start. If you have questions, you can add that to the bottom of this feed, and then I will also add a link directly into the comments of where you can go to sign up for my newsletter for this particular group. If you're already on my newsletter for my email, just my normal newsletter list, this is a separate email. This is just for this group. I'm just giving this info and these resources just to this group. So if you're not on that, I will put a link and you'll want to get on there ASAP because I'll get that sent out right after this. So thank you all for joining, and I will get that to you soon.